So I've been providing some models and examples of how to design a space-time travel machine. And I've been designing space-time travel machines for decades now. I would say that the first conscious awareness I had of this kind of space-time travel occurred probably, certainly wasn't the first time that I experienced space-time travel, but it was the first time that I was consciously aware that I was in the midst of this experience. And that was probably in either 1981 or 1982. And the occasion was that I was taking an SAT test, Scholastic Aptitude Test. And as a dysgraphic, the experience of attempting to fill out a Scantron form in the midst of like an anxiety-producing high high-stakes testing situation was produced kind of extreme difficulty in the performance of the handwriting. So this extreme difficulty gets translated in my experience as a dysgraphic into a kind of physical pain in the act of writing. And so I was experiencing this pain, and one could say I had an experience of dissociation. I prefer to call it space-time travel. I began to imagine that there was music playing, and it very much reminded me at the time of Jimi Hendrix, specifically some of the more feedback-informed works of his, and the works with a lot of freeform and distortion, like Voodoo Child and pieces like that. So later, years later, decades later, I found a recording by a group called the can't quite remember the name, but something like Davis Redmond Trio, and I found the exact same tunes on this the songs music recorded on this CD that I had experienced when I was taking the SAT test in 1981, and this was many years later. The artist was an American guitarist, Lobel, I think his name was. I can't remember his first name right now, but he had worked with the German avant-garde rock band Faust, and done some work with other experimental musicians as well, and this music surprised me because it reminded me of the experience, and brought me back to that experience and to the whole phenomenon of space-time travel that I had begun to work on, not in the 80s, but I would say consciously began to work on at least by the late 90s. So I've been exploring these different ways of creating makeshift situations in which space-time travel is possible, via a lot of different elements, including the active engagement of memory, accident, and other forms of moving in space and time. So one of the methods employed recently was to look at the advice of the experts, and some of those experts in the field are from scientific communities and quantum physics, quantum mechanics, quantum theory, is part of that investigation of space-time travel, and we've engaged the idea of authority and what that means in and of itself as this performative. So an authority, an expert, professional has the cultural blessing, we might say, to speak of certain processes and certain mechanics. And in that blessing, that performative blessing, that blessing of performativity, these authors or these professionals speak in ways that are given more authority and more respect, right, than those of us who don't bear these credentials and things like that. So this was part of the investigation of space-time travel. If one's PhD or position in university was enough, to provide one with a good, working model of a time machine, or if one needed to look further. I found a YouTube lecture by an individual named Dr. Seth Lloyd that was particularly good. He's a professor at MIT and refers to himself as a quantum mechanic. And I was looking for something in the lecture that would be a way in for me as someone without credentials, that authorize this kind of work. If I could find, some means, so either space-time, opening, coordinate, that would grant me access to, this kind of experience. And I found one, and he was remarking, it was almost an aside, and he made this comment, and I guess he had been referring to one of his colleagues' places of origin, and he said, "The birds are quick to leave Hamburg in winter," and that line really struck me as a potential portal, space-time portal. So I took the line, "The birds are quick to leave Hamburg in winter," and I put it in quotation marks, and I plugged it back into a Google search on the web, and what it generated was a lot of information regarding both Hamburg and migratory birds. Very, very rarely both at the same time. So this line, "The birds are quick to leave Hamburg in winter," in a certain sense was already broken up, by the search engine into these, component parts, and that, in a way, is a form of space-time travel. This breaking apart. One of the closest semantic references that I could get to the line in its entirety was from a site dealing with the behavior and loss of the experience of birds in wintertime over the course of the industrialization of a certain area, and the line read more or less, "Where there were once an abundance of birds in the yard," and then it went on, but that's where I ended my take on that. where there were once an abundance of birds in the yard. And I thought, this line, it brought me back to an experience that I had. And for me, it reminded me of a poem of David Anton's, which, as I recall it, it was based on a kind of Jungian psychological word association test, where you say a word and then the subject that you're testing responds with a word or a phrase. And this poem went something like, we said, and then we said bird, say, for example, and then the poem went on, and she said, there were once birds here. There was, and so this poem, which occurred in a volume of David's called Meditations. I can't remember what the publishing date was, but this volume I had borrowed from David's father-in-law, who was going by the name of Peter Moore, and that was the name that he used as a painter. He was a painter of these really lovely watercolor-like images that reminded me of the sort of decalomatia, I think it was called, that some of the surrealists, including Max Ernst, practiced, but they were very much more sort of delicate and refined than that, and very colorful, and they looked like these sort of surreal underwater scenes. And he used that name Peter Moore as an artist. His real name was Joseph Barna, and he was a Hungarian, and he had escaped the devastations of the Holocaust. He was an elderly man, and he used to come over, and he would sometimes share his he liked sherry. He really liked sherry as a drink, and he would bring over like a little bottle of sherry, and he would talk about these Hungarian poets from the early part of the 20th century, and he was loosely associated with a few Hungarian avant-garde magazines at one time, and wrote poems about the devastations of the Holocaust and the horrors of that the Nazis imposed on the Jewish people at the time. And he was no longer really a poet, but his paintings were quite lovely, and we had this relationship. Anyway, he had lent me this book of David's Meditations, and so I had access to a copy of this. And I think this poem was also in Jerry Rothenberg's anthology, The Big Jewish Book, and collected there as well. And anyway, so this poem was about, it employed this psychological, this Jungian word association test. That was the mechanism. And it did so to evoke these sentimental memories that presumably, this older person had of what was once. And so it was in some ways about, if not time travel, this memory that this individual had that others no longer had access to. So related to this idea of time and change and transformation, and an association, a bringing, as in the way that metaphor carries one thing to another. The carrying was done here by the word game. The word is presented, and then the response to the word is where the word takes you, right? So anyway, I thought that's a really interesting, deployment, and the psychology of it is relevant to this project that I'm working on. And then after thinking about that poem of David's, inspired by the line where there were once an abundance of birds in the yard, which once again, that line came from plugging into a Google search the line from Dr. Seth Lloyd's Quantum Mechanics of Time Travel lecture, "The birds are quick to leave Hamburg in winter," which, so, that connection, that association I made was also in a way like the Jungian word association, right? But but the associations are in part, made by these artificial intelligences, or I don't even know if you can call them that, but these searches. So they're in part technological. This associated with that, like picking up certain words from this and placing it there, and then my more emotional response and my memory. So this personalized inventory, almost Proustian, that I dip into this well of memories and come up with. So in a number of ways, the Jungian, that Jungian word association model is at work, technologized in a certain sense in the Google searching, but also, then, subjectivized or animated by my subjectivity when I begin to, employ my memory in the associations made with these elements. So, of course, Peter, who had lent me the book on meditation, was in some ways, metaphorically like these birds, right? So he was an older person and recounting memories of a past that no longer existed and that had been troubled and problematized by one of the most horrible examples of oppression and genocide, that history knows. And so what was once, there were once and there are no longer. And the ideas that are generated, in these associations, for me, take on, greater and greater significance the more that one can connect the depths of an understanding of what was once and what is no longer. So, inspired by that connection, I began, thinking a little further about both, the Jungian word association game as a form of space-time travel and all of the entailments of this particular memory. And one of the things that I thought about in terms of this particular memory is, how I had deployed that particular poem of David's. Now, I was a student of David Anton's in the early and late 80s at UCSD, and one of the ways that Anton, taught poetry was he would encourage all of his students to find materials that were ready-made. I've been talking about collecting recently as opposed to other kinds of ways of organizing materials. But collecting is you look for things that are extant in the world, and sometimes conceptual poetry is associated with these collectings of extant materials. David had a number of pieces that were based on these collectings. One that comes to mind is, the code of flag behavior, which is almost verbatim, the code for the way that one handles a flag, and of course it became metaphorical. So these found materials become significant through metaphor, and metaphor is one of the things that we've been, looking at in terms of space-time travel. And then all of these metaphors with the birds and all of that, again, reminding me of Peter and the connection with why I had the book of meditations, but how this particular poem was a metaphor of his life and the lives of all of these, displaced people, like not just the birds that were once there, but all of these people that either are no more because of these grave tragedies of history, or that had been displaced. So again, working back into my work with other areas. And anyway, the way that I had deployed this particular poem, it was somewhat interesting. So David was talking to us about, finding these materials, and his idea of teaching writing was really about the mechanics of writing, like editing, and the mechanics of collage, the mechanics of montage, the mechanics of of finding ways to take material and to transform it, into these different forms. And the ideas would be there, and you would find a way of estranging them, in that Russian formalist sense, or you would find ways of metaphorizing them in different ways, finding different kinds of forms to work. And he also was very interested in this idea of writing editing as an analogy with cinematic editing or film editing. So you were really editing this thing in time, right? Like taking it and like changing its tempo, working with different ways of organizing and structuring it, breaking it up, putting it back together. Very much like you would imagine that writing was this materiality, and you were working on a collage or like a cubist painting or like a collage, either the way that the surrealists worked with collage to reveal and display elements of the unconscious. But David wasn't really interested in that. His collages were more like these ways of elegantly organizing space and time. So again, probably had more in common with Duchamp and Cubism and and to some extent Bauhaus and other technical, right, organizations and associations of form and content relationships than other things, and the rationale for finding this material, and David talks about it in his discussion of another one of his students of Kathy Acker after she passed, and he has a lecture in which he talks about her work and her collage style. He talks about the rationale for using this found material was because, and he said this, I'm not a psychologist, and I didn't want to deal with these students' difficulties in being asked to handle their own work or own material. So in other words, the idea that like one's own material would get in the way of one's editing, right, and would get in the way of one's ability to criticize the way that these materials, like which if they were yours, you could associate with your life, and so if they were found, if they were extant, if they were part of the world, then there would be less resistance on the part of the experiencing subject to work with these materials and to have these materials critically examined. So that was the rationale that he discusses in that piece on Kathy Acker. Now, I can't remember if he said these kinds of things as early as the 80s, or if I space-time traveled into the future and discovered that idea, from much later. But in any case, whether he was saying this at the time that I was working with him, or whether at that time I had already begun, the space-time travel process, I had this interesting idea that, well, in this piece, right, he's using this psychiatric model to generate materials, but the rationale for using other people's materials is not being a psychologist. So that was a kind of like collision for me. So I thought, oh, well, wouldn't it be amusing to take that piece in which there's already an embedded contradiction between the way that David was teaching us and justifying the teaching of us with these found materials, and the fact that in this particular instance, he's playing the part of, this sort of Jungian word association examiner and bringing up all this like unconscious loss. And then I was also really interested in it because of the way that poem metaphorized my relationship with Peter, is what we called him, with Joseph Barna. It metaphorized my relationship with Peter, and in an interesting way, that relationship was, known by David, but we rarely discussed, Peter's, significance in either one of our lives. So I used, this poem of David's as the starting point, and I didn't, say, that this is your material. This is material that I found from you. I just presented this, piece, and then we began working on the process of this critical editing of it, right? And what was really interesting was he didn't say, "Oh, that's my material." He said, "I wrote a piece very similar to this," and then he pointed me to the book, Meditations, and showed me, the passage. And I said, "Oh, that's interesting." I didn't come out and reveal myself at that time. I just let that sort of play out. Alan Capro had this piece, and it had to do with ablutions or washings, and one of the final parts of the piece was, in this, they begin with like this personal level, and then they progress and they expand out like a larger and larger concentric circles of the social, and towards the end of the piece, maybe the last part of it, it's he suggests putting jam or jelly on a car, and then you very carefully wash this vehicle. Or he says you can take it to a car wash, but if you take it to a car wash, he says, like, don't explain why the jam or the jelly is there. Like, let people, let the mystery of that. He doesn't say let the mystery of that, but he says he notes to the performer that if it's taken to a car wash, it should be done in this really casual way. So obviously, like, that the part of the piece is not informing the reader entirely, or the audience entirely, of the significance of the why. And so this was kind of going on in the way that I was working with this piece of David's that I had appropriated, and that David and I were editing in the process of acting out these roles of professor and student, and utilizing this material. And this material had a material history of borrowings and lendings, and this material had a history of form and content relationships, including the form and content of psychiatry and psychology, and where like this word association test came from, and how it was being deployed, and then the odd sort of askew metaframe of I'm not a psychologist, that's why I'm not dealing with these issues, where within the piece, he's very much dealing with those issues. So anyway, all of that was already there for me, and within my memories of that experience in this line, where there were once an abundance of birds in the yard. So that particular line, having generated all of that material from my memory and my ways of working, and these, like, what's said and what's not said, and how what is said can generate more of what's said within the rules of a game, but also like the secrets that exist in games that are played, betwixt and between the rules of a game, where the unspoken becomes much more important than the spoken. And in for example, the way that Peter Moore Joseph Barna's life in Hungary and escape from the Nazis, but the experience of death and suffering that never left him, were unspokens in these lovely watercolor-like images on his walls, and were unspoken in his love of Beethoven and his interested in these Hungarian poets, but were present, and that these unspoken things were in some ways what made the work much more interesting than it would have been if there were not unspoken things in it, and in some ways that the unspeaking was much more interesting than if it had been able to be spoken. So all of that, having come in to this particular attempt to establish a space-time coordinate, I really wanted to utilize, the original expression as a title. The birds are quick to leave hAmburg in winter, but to utilize as form this this passage that I had found in this text on the migratory birds, where there were once an abundance of birds in the yard, because of all of that, that it had generated for me. So, so that is a kind of long introduction to the building of a certain kind of space-time travel device, and then the results of the space-time travel device is, simply going to be a poem that I had generated using the iterative form of "where there were once" that had come from this line that had so much resonance for me, in terms of memory and metaphor. And so the second part of this piece is going to be a reading of that poem. The birds are quick to leave hAmburg in winter. Where there were once an abundance of birds in the yard, where there were once wild berries, grass, seed, acorns, nuts, earthworms, and grubs. Where there were once the distant sounds of the songs of mockingbirds, where there were once bird watchers from as far as Hong Kong and hAmburg, where there were once brown thrashers, blue jays, northern orioles, where there were once dark-eyed juncos, tree sparrows, and hummingbirds, where there were once backyard feeding stations, where there were once elevated shallow bowls filled with clean water, where there were once intricately and elegantly designed boxes crafted from pieces of wood and metal, mounted carefully on the beams of houses or upon branches, where there were once residents, where there were once guests, where there were once only passers through, where there were once flights, where there were once gatherings, where there were once songs, where there were once moltings, where there were once matings, where there were once some who braved the cold of winter, who stayed, where there were once some who fled the cold of winter, who left, where there were once some who awaited the warmth of spring, where there were some who returned only when the warmth of spring had arrived once again. Where there were once some who, once having left, never returned again.